The chandelier light trembled above them, its crystal edges catching the tension in the room, as if they too could sense the humiliation unfolding. She was only passing behind his table, balancing a tray with the silent grace of someone used to disappearing, when the prince, leaning back in his tailored desert sand suit, let out a dismissive laugh. He threw a remark at her in his Gulf dialect, the kind with softened consonants and that leisurely, aristocratic drawl that nobles use when they believe no one around them matters. The nearby executives smirked. One of them arched a brow, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't. Instead, she set the tray down with a steady hand and replied in flawless, classical Arabic. Controlled breath, measured cadence, the kind of linguistic purity that carries centuries of scholarship without ever needing to announce it. There was no challenge in her voice, no rebuttal, no spark of defiance, just calm, pristine articulation. The room froze. A fork scraped. Someone's breath caught. Even the prince's pen slipped from between his fingers, tapping once against the marble table before rolling toward the edge. His jaw tightened, then unclenched, as if recalibrating the hierarchy he thought was immovable. Her posture remained still, humble even, but the dignity in her tone wrapped the space in a quiet gravity that none of them expected. She stepped back, nodding politely, then turned to leave. No rush, no pride, only that steady composure of someone who has survived harder rooms than this one. He watched her go, the humiliation already shifting into something sharper, curiosity mixed with the sting of being seen more clearly than he intended. Sometimes, the moment you try to belittle someone becomes the moment you reveal your own smallness. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. She didn't go home after her shift. Home wasn't really a place anymore. Just a rented basement room that smelled faintly of detergent and damp concrete, its single window level with the ankles of passers-by on the street. She walked there anyway, shoes soft against the night pavement, the city lights flickering over her face like they were searching for her story. Her phone buzzed twice with messages from the debt office. She didn't open them. The last time she did, she'd spent an hour in the stairwell, fighting the tightness in her chest. Immigration renewals, overdue balances, a scholarship that had vanished when the university funding collapsed. Her life was a set of stacked papers waiting to be pushed off a desk. She sat on the edge of her thin mattress, toes touching the cold floor, and let her mind drift back to the world she had left behind. Lecture halls with sun-warmed stone walls. Professors who spoke to her with a quiet respect she never quite believed she deserved. Languages layered like old ruins waiting to be brushed clean. Her notebooks filled with centuries-old scripts she once thought she'd spend her life teaching. Then everything had unraveled. A sudden death in the family. Bills. A border that closed, then opened, then closed again. And the quiet humiliation of taking the first job that would sponsor her residency. Waitressing in a city where nobody asked about her degrees, only whether she could carry 3 plates at once. She leaned back, letting exhaustion ripple through her. The prince's face flickered in her memory, the sharp pause in him, the way the whole table had inhaled at once. She hadn't meant to draw attention. She never did. Attention was dangerous. Attention asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. But something in his expression before she walked away. Something unsettled her, more than the debt messages, more than the uncertainty of tomorrow. The world often mistakes silence for weakness, but silence is usually where resilience learns to breathe. She exhaled slowly, unaware that her life had already been pulled into his gravity. The summons arrived the next morning, tucked awkwardly into an envelope that didn't belong in a waitress's locker. Her manager handed it to her with the uncomfortable caution of someone delivering news that might either save or ruin a life. The seal wasn't royal, no crest, no flourish, just a discreet emblem from the prince's private office. That made it worse, more intentional, more direct. She stood in the staff corridor, fluorescent lights humming above her, apron still knotted at her waist, pulse flicking like a nervous metronome. Inside the envelope, a simple request. The prince wished to speak with her. No explanation, no tone, no time to prepare her breathing. Her first instinct was to ignore it. People like her didn't get summoned by billionaires unless something had gone terribly wrong. But curiosity pressed against her ribs, steady and persistent. She thought of the moment last night, the way his laughter had died mid-sound, the subtle shock in his eyes when she responded with a dialect reserved for scholars and ancient texts. She hadn't meant to disrupt anything. She'd only meant to survive another shift. Outside, the city felt too bright, the sun hitting metal and glass, as she made her way to the address listed. A private office tower, minimalist and dangerously quiet, with security guards who didn't search her so much as observe her, as if trying to figure out why someone dressed like her had been allowed through the doors. The elevator ride stretched on forever. Soft music, mirrored walls, her reflection staring back at her, tired, underslept, but composed. She smoothed her hair, swallowed her nerves, and stepped into a waiting room where the silence felt curated. Then the door opened. A private secretary with a clipped, polished accent invited her in. The prince stood alone near the window, city sprawling behind him. But something was off. Not arrogance, not the effortless dominance he displayed last night. This was a man who had rehearsed a dozen greetings and abandoned all of them the moment she entered the room. He didn't smile. He didn't command. He simply stared at her as if trying to understand why her presence unsettled the architecture of his certainty. Power feels different when the person you underestimated walks back into your world on her own terms. She inhaled, steadying herself, awaiting whatever this moment was about to ask of her. He gestured toward a chair, but the motion wasn't smooth. It faltered halfway, a subtle hesitation that betrayed the crack in his confidence. Morning lights spilled across the room in long gold bands, catching the tension between them like fine dust suspended in air. She sat only when he stepped back, keeping the respectful distance she had learned in every job, every border office, every room where power made its own gravity. "I owe you an apology." He spoke slowly, his Gulf dialect softened. The arrogance from last night melted into something quieter. He didn't look at her directly. His eyes stayed on the skyline, as though the city might forgive him more easily than she could. She listened, hands folded in her lap, posture steady. No reaction, no flicker of triumph. She wasn't here for his remorse. She wasn't sure why she was here at all. He exhaled, shoulders dropping. "I misread the situation." Another pause. "I misread you." He finally turned. The facade he wore in public, polished, authoritative, untouchable, was gone. What stood before her now was a man wrestling with the unfamiliar feeling of doubt. Beneath the tailored suit and measured voice, something strained, something almost vulnerable. She didn't rush to ease his discomfort. She simply waited, composed and silent, giving him space to finish whatever he had summoned her for. He cleared his throat, fingers tightening briefly at his side. "Last night, your response. The way you spoke." A brief shake of the head, not disbelief. "Respect. You showed discipline, grace. It made me realize how easily I treat people as background." Her chest tightened, not with sympathy, but with the memory of years spent being exactly that. Background, service, silence. "I want to make amends," he said, "if you'll allow it." She didn't answer immediately. The room's air seemed to thicken as she considered her words carefully. She wasn't used to men like him apologizing. She wasn't used to anyone apologizing. Across from her, the prince stood very still, waiting. Not commanding, not assuming. Waiting like a man who understood that her next sentence might shift something in him. Respect begins in the moment you realize someone owed you nothing yet still chose to listen. She lifted her gaze, ready to decide the terms of this fragile new balance. She let the silence stretch, measured, intentional, almost ceremonial. Outside the window, the city moved in blurred shapes, but inside the office, everything felt suspended, held between his apology and her decision. She wasn't intimidated by power anymore. Life had already crushed that reflex out of her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity she used when reciting texts from memory. "If I am to have any involvement with you or your work," she began, "it must be on conditions that protect my time, my dignity, and my boundaries." A flicker, barely visible, passed through his expression. Not annoyance, relief. As if structure, even one imposed on him, grounded him. She continued, steady and unyielding. "I cannot risk my job at the restaurant. I cannot promise availability at any hour you choose, and I will not be spoken to the way I was last night, by you or anyone in your circle." Each word landed with the precision of someone who had spent her life negotiating with systems far harsher than this man could ever be. He nodded almost too quickly. "Of course. Additionally," she said, tightening her fingers in her lap before relaxing them again, "I need clarity. If you ask something of me, I need to know why. Not details that compromise your work. Only purpose. I do not follow vague requests." This time, the prince's jaw tightened, not in defiance but in recognition. She was drawing boundaries no one had ever dared draw with him. And he respected her more for it. He stepped closer, but cautiously, like someone approaching a fragile truth. "I can accept all of that." Her breath eased, but only slightly. She had learned never to trust the first acceptance of powerful men. Still, his tone carried a seriousness she couldn't ignore. "I want you involved because—" He hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly with the weight of unspoken complexity. "Because I may need someone with your discipline, your clarity, your steadiness. Not now. Not yet. But soon." She didn't flinch, though something deep inside her stirred, an old academic instinct she had buried under survival. "Then we proceed slowly," she said. "On my terms." The prince nodded again, more sure this time. "On your terms. Boundaries are the architecture of self-respect, and the right people never fear them." She folded her hands, ready for whatever came next in this unlikely, uneasy alliance. The next days unfolded like a quiet storm. No thunder, no spectacle, just a steady pressure building beneath the surface of her life. She continued working double shifts at the restaurant, tying her apron each morning with fingers still aching from the night before. But now there was an invisible thread between her and the prince, a tension that neither of them fully understood yet. He didn't summon her again immediately. Instead, his office sent brief, respectful messages. Small check-ins, careful inquiries about her schedule, always framed around her boundaries. She answered sparingly, her words measured, unwilling to blur the lines she had drawn. But she felt the shift. In the way the manager looked at her when a sleek black car occasionally waited outside after her shift. In the way customers paused when she carried trays with her usual precision, as if sensing that something in her life was changing, even if she refused to acknowledge it. Late at night, in her basement room, she replayed the prince's expression, the way his confidence had cracked open just enough to reveal something human beneath the wealth and entitlement. It unsettled her. Not romantically, not dangerously, just deeply, as though someone had noticed her existence, not by accident, but with intention. She didn't trust intention. Still, whenever her phone buzzed with a message from his office, a faint tightness lit up inside her chest. Not fear, not excitement, something more complex, a recognition of a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. Meanwhile, cracks began forming around him too. Rumors reached the restaurant, soft whispers from guests who recognized his name. A major acquisition delayed. An advisor seen leaving his headquarters looking unusually tense. Nothing solid, nothing confirmed, but enough to hint that the prince's world was shifting under its own weight. One evening, he appeared outside the restaurant himself. No entourage, no spectacle. Just him, leaning against a quiet car, hands clasped behind his back. When she stepped out, still tying her coat, their eyes met with a tension that hummed like static. "I didn't want to disturb you," he said gently. "I only wanted to walk with you a moment, if you'll allow it." She should have refused. Instead, she nodded once, controlled and non-committal, and they walked side by side through the cool night air. Two people from incompatible worlds moving in an uneasy, delicate parallel. Trust doesn't begin with grand gestures, but with the moments when someone chooses to come to you without armor. And as they walked beneath the dim city lamps, neither of them realized how deeply entangled their paths were about to become. They walked without speaking at first, their steps falling into an unplanned rhythm along the narrow street where late-night cafes were closing and metal shutters clattered down. The city felt softer at this hour, the air tinged with cooking spices and cold asphalt, a kind of breathing space neither of them found in daylight. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, shoulders slightly lifted, a small shield she used whenever the world felt too close. He noticed, though he pretended not to. His gaze kept drifting toward her, then away, as if trying to read a language he wasn't fluent in. Finally, he spoke. "People in my world don't tell me no." His tone wasn't boastful. It was an admission, a quiet fracture in the armor he'd worn all his life. She glanced at him, the streetlight catching the faint tension at the corner of his mouth. "People in your world aren't used to being asked who they are when no one is watching." He stopped walking, just for a breath. Her words had slipped past the surface and hit somewhere deeper. A micro-reaction, his shoulders tightening, a soft exhale through his nose, the kind of controlled discomfort only someone raised inside power would understand. He resumed walking, a fraction slower. "You speak like someone who's seen more than she says." She didn't answer. Silence was safer. Silence was what had kept her alive through borders, debts, and the kind of disappointments that hollow you out from the inside. But inside that silence, she felt something else. An intuition simmering, something that told her the prince's world was beginning to tilt. He walked with the heaviness of a man carrying too many moving parts: business, reputation, secrets he wasn't yet naming. She wasn't prying, but she sensed the shift the way a sailor senses a change in wind before the storm appears. They reached the corner where their paths would split. She stopped first, grounding herself. He faced her fully for the first time all night, his expression stripped of titles and pride. There was a question in his eyes, unspoken but palpable. "Will you stay in my orbit or step away?" She offered a small nod, neutral, cautious but real. Not a promise, only acknowledgement. It was enough to make something in him ease, if only for a second. "Good night," he said softly. She turned and walked toward her basement room, feeling the pressure of his gaze on her back, though he never moved. Connection often begins as a tremor, felt before it's understood, feared before it's named. Neither of them slept easily that night. The anomaly didn't reveal itself in a dramatic flash. It slipped quietly into her life, the way truth often does, sideways, uninvited, disguised as something harmless. He had asked her, with an unusual gentleness, if she could help him review a set of items his team had recently acquired. No obligation, he'd said, just perspective. She agreed only because he framed it within her boundaries. 1 hour, neutral location, no assumptions. They met in a private study room, in one of his cultural foundations. Soft lamplight, warm wood, nothing extravagant. A few objects lay on a velvet-lined table, presented without context. He didn't hover. He didn't push. He stood back, hands clasped behind him, letting her breathe. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Old pages, worn edges, bindings that carried the soft crumble of time. She approached them, not as a scholar reclaiming her past, but as someone touching a memory she had once buried. Her fingers hovered, respectful, barely grazing the surfaces. Then, very subtly, something tugged at her attention. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even wrong. It was simply out of place. A curvature in a letter form that didn't belong to the century, suggested by the material around it. Not an error a novice would make, but something produced by a hand trained in a style slightly too modern for the supposed period. The ink hue, faintly oxidized, yes, but inconsistently so, as though aged in conditions too uniform to be natural. She didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. Years of discipline kept her face calm, composed, unreadable. But inside, something clicked. The same instinct that once guided her research shifted awake, stretching like a long-suppressed animal. The room around her tightened, the soft lamplight sharpening against the edges of her thoughts. She turned one page slowly, her breath steady. Another detail caught her eye. A marginal note with orthographic habits that didn't match the script's historical context. Again, subtle, almost brilliant in its mimicry. But she saw it. The prince watched her from a distance, reading the micro-movements in her posture, the way her shoulders aligned, the faint narrowing of her eyes, the slight tilt of her head, signs she wasn't aware she was giving. He spoke carefully. "You see something?" Not a question, not pressure. A gentle recognition. She hesitated, the weight of her past life suddenly pressing against her ribs. To speak would be to cross a threshold. To remain silent would be to betray the instinct she had spent years burying. Finally, she placed one hand on the table, grounding herself. "There is something here," she said quietly. "Something small, but real." He stepped closer, tension flickering across his features. Not fear, but a dawning understanding that whatever path he thought he was on was shifting. Anomalies rarely shout. They whisper to the people who still know how to listen. She exhaled slowly, knowing this was only the beginning. That night, sleep evaded her. The anomaly followed her home like a shadow that refused to dissolve, lingering in the corners of her small basement room. She lay on her thin mattress, hands folded over her stomach, staring at the cracked paint on the ceiling, while her mind replayed every curve, every stroke, every faint inconsistency she had seen. It wasn't just the object itself that unsettled her. It was what it awakened inside her. She had promised herself she would never return to that world. The academic corridors where her brilliance made her visible in all the wrong ways, where professors praised her in public but let paperwork swallow her funding, where colleagues admired her mind, yet quietly expected her to carry burdens none of them faced. She had built a life out of distance, out of silence, out of survival. But that single anomaly had cracked something open. A small fissure, yes, but fissures grow. All evening, she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Perhaps she had misremembered. Perhaps she was rusty after so many years away from manuscripts and analysis. The thought soothed her for a moment, then felt like a lie. Her instincts were too sharp, her training too ingrained. She knew what she had seen, even if she wasn't ready to speak it aloud. And then there was him. The prince had watched her with attention he tried to hide, but she read it in the micro-shifts, the controlled breath, the tightening of his fingers behind his back, the brief flicker of worry across his eyes. He hadn't told her why he needed her. But now she felt the gravity. Whatever he was entangled in, it was larger than a simple acquisition. A faint tremor of fear threaded through her. Not for herself. She had lived with uncertainty long enough to wear it like skin. But for what her involvement might pull her into. Was she prepared to step back into a world she had abandoned? Could she afford not to? Every answer led to another question, each one heavier than the last. She sat up abruptly, hands gripping her knees. If she continued, she risked everything she had rebuilt. If she walked away, she would never silence the voice inside her that whispered, "You saw it. You know." Dilemma tightened around her like a second spine. She closed her eyes, breathing through the weight of choice. Clarity is often born in the moments when both options terrify you for different reasons. And as dawn crept across the edge of her small window, she knew she would have to decide soon. The prince called her the next morning, not through an assistant, not through a polite message, but directly. His voice was low, strained, carrying the quiet urgency of a man trying not to reveal how deeply the ground was shifting beneath him. "I need your eyes again," he said, "only if you choose to come." Those last words, "if you choose," landed heavier than any demand could have. She arrived at his private foundation shortly before noon. The sky outside was sharp and bright, but the room he led her into was dim, lit only by a series of narrow lamps that cast long shadows across the table, where several more items awaited her. These were different, older, more intricate, and clearly more valuable. He didn't hover. He didn't speak. He simply stood near the wall, hands clasped behind him, tension radiating off him in thin, controlled waves. She approached the table with slow steps, her breath steadying even as her heart pressed against her ribs. Something about the arrangement, the variety of materials, the inconsistent aging, the mixture of scripts, immediately told her this was no casual concern. Someone had curated these pieces with intention. But intention toward what? She examined the first item. The script appeared authentic at a glance, but the ink's oxidation pattern was eerily uniform, as if aged under manipulated conditions. The second item contained a marginal note in a style that belonged to a scholar 2 centuries later than the manuscript suggested. The third used a binding technique, inconsistent with its supposed region of origin, subtle but unmistakable. The anomalies weren't isolated. They were systemic. As she leaned closer, the room seemed to constrict around her. Her fingers hovered millimeters above the parchment, her mind racing through years of training she had tried so desperately to bury. Behind her, the prince shifted for the first time. A small movement, barely audible, but she felt it. He was watching her, like a man who already knew the shape of the truth, but needed to hear it from someone who could no longer be dismissed. Her throat tightened. She wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He stepped forward. "There's more," he said quietly. "I didn't show you everything yesterday." His voice carried weight, a warning, a confession, maybe both. She looked up at him, and for a moment, the space between them was filled with something raw, a shared recognition that whatever she discovered today would bind them both to consequences neither could fully foresee. She turned back to the objects, forcing her breathing into a steadier rhythm. Each detail grew sharper, more intrusive, clawing at her years of buried expertise. This wasn't a flaw. It wasn't negligence. It was orchestration, done by someone meticulous, knowledgeable, and dangerously confident. The prince's next words broke the silence. "If these are not what they claim to be," he murmured, "my entire acquisition, worth hundreds of millions, collapses." A cold ripple spread through her chest. She wasn't just examining history. She was holding the threads of a catastrophe. Responsibility is the heaviest when you never asked for it, but can no longer walk away. Her pulse steadied. She leaned in. The forensic unraveling had begun. The room felt colder now, as if the truth itself had lowered the temperature. She stood over the table, spine straight, breath steady, while the prince waited a few steps behind her, silent, braced, a man preparing for impact. She didn't rush. Forensic work never belonged to speed, it belonged to precision. She slid the first manuscript gently beneath the lamp. Under the warm beam, the ink revealed its betrayal. Natural oxidation never behaved so uniformly, never settled so neatly along the grain. This was accelerated aging. Chemical, controlled, purposeful. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. This ink hasn't lived the centuries it claims. The prince closed his eyes briefly. Not in disbelief, in recognition. She moved to the second item. Script analysis came to her like an old language she had once spoken fluently. The letter forms were beautifully executed. But beauty can be a trap. The baseline alignment carried the influence of a later Nazca evolution, the kind that only appeared after a particular 14th century standardization. Yet the surrounding text claimed to predate that by generations. This scribe never lived in the century attributed, she said. His breath caught, barely audible. She lifted the third item. The vellum felt wrong, too smooth for its supposed age, the pores too evenly stretched. Real vellum carries the memory of the animal, the irregularities of its life. This one had been scraped and treated with a modern technique designed to mimic age, but not perfectly. She placed it down. The material is artificially aged. He stepped forward now, the tension cracking through him. All of them? Her eyes moved across the table. Every piece, every binding, every marginal note, every script shared the same fingerprints of fabrication. Not sloppy, not amateur. This was the work of a high-level forger who understood paleography deeply, but not flawlessly. Someone who counted on buyers who admired beauty but lacked the discipline to interrogate it. She inhaled slowly. Then she delivered the final blow. The provenance attached to this collection is impossible. The dialectal features in these annotations belong to different regions, different centuries, different scholarly traditions. No archive, no monastery, no private estate would contain this combination naturally. Silence fell. Heavy, definitive, lethal. The prince's composure fractured in micro-movements. The faint tremor at the jaw, the tightening of his grip against the table edge, the single exhale that betrayed fear, not anger. He stared at the manuscripts as though seeing them for the first time, not as treasures, but as weapons used against him. Then it's a fabrication, he said, a complete construction. A deliberate one, she replied, and extraordinarily expensive. Whoever built this wanted you to believe it without question. His voice dropped, lower and darker than she had ever heard it. $500 million, he murmured. Signed, sealed, and celebrated. She watched him. Not the billionaire, not the prince, but the man bearing the weight of betrayal. And for the first time, he did not hide it. Truth cuts deepest when it exposes the wounds you thought were well protected. The collapse had begun. He didn't sit, he didn't speak, he simply stood there. One hand braced on the edge of the table, the other hanging helplessly at his side as the reality soaked through him like ink bleeding into cloth. The soft lamplight carved harsh shadows across his face, revealing the exhaustion he'd tried to hide beneath tailored suits and unbreakable confidence. She stepped back, giving him space. The weight of what she had revealed pressed on the room itself. Dense, suffocating, a collapse that demanded quiet. Finally, he exhaled, a slow, fractured breath. $500 million, gone. The words were not anger, they were grief. She watched him carefully. Not with sympathy, he didn't need pity, but with the measured attention of someone who understood what it meant for a life to tilt in a single moment. His empire would survive a financial loss. Yes. But this wasn't about money. This was about trust, pride, identity. A prince raised to believe he could read people, control outcomes, foresee danger. And yet the forgery had walked straight through his gates wearing beauty as armor. His shoulders lowered as if someone had cut invisible strings. How could this happen? My advisors, my board, forgery at this level, she said gently, is designed to bypass the eyes trained for business. It preys on confidence, reputation, and speed. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment she saw the rawness beneath his status, a man betrayed by those who understood his weaknesses better than he did. "Tell me what you need," he said, "whatever it takes to uncover who did this. Whatever resources, whatever access." She raised a hand. "Not yet. You're in no state to make promises." His jaw tightened, not in defiance, humility, reluctantly learned. She continued, quieter now. "You need to understand something before we proceed. Exposure of this scale doesn't just threaten you. It threatens your advisors, your partners, your public reputation. Whoever orchestrated this knew it would create chaos." He moved closer, slow and steady, the anger now crystallizing into focus. "Then help me, please." She felt a shift, a crossing of a line neither of them had named. This was no longer academic analysis. This was forensic unraveling tied to political weight, personal ruin, and the kind of enemies who didn't make mistakes by accident. Her pulse steadied. She met his gaze with the calm of someone who had held fragile truths before. "This isn't just a forgery," she said. "It's a coordinated operation. And if we follow the threads, we're going to find people who don't want to be seen." He swallowed hard. "Then we go carefully. We have no other choice." For a moment, the room softened, the collapse settling into something resolute, something that could become strength if handled correctly. Pain becomes transformation when you face it instead of hiding from it. She turned back to the table, ready to step into the storm alongside him. She requested a different room. No windows, no staff, no surveillance. He agreed without hesitation. They moved into a secure archive chamber in the Foundation's lower levels, where the walls were thick concrete and the air carried the faint coolness of preserved history. He closed the door himself, a gesture that told her he no longer trusted anyone else to guard the threshold. The table between them became a battlefield of quiet revelations. She laid out the forged pieces with deliberate precision, grouping them not by neon dye or material, but by similarities so subtle most eyes would miss them. "Look here," she said softly, pointing not to the script, but to the pressure patterns, minute variations in stroke weight that suggested the same hand had produced pieces allegedly centuries apart. The prince leaned in, tension tightening the line of his shoulders. "Now here," she continued, showing the binding threads. "This dye mixture is modern. Expertly concealed, but modern." He inhaled sharply. His advisors had praised these bindings as signs of exceptional preservation, but the truth unraveled under lamplight, thread by thread. Then she opened a small leather folder she had asked him for. The full provenance chain his acquisition team had received. She set the documents out in a grid. Dates, transfers, estate names, shipping logs. At first glance, everything looked impeccable, but she noticed the cracks instantly. Certain estate names repeated across unrelated transactions, always in moments of political instability, strategic, opportunistic. Handwriting on 3 different certificates carried identical tendencies in terminal strokes, despite being attributed to different archivists. Citations claimed to reference catalogs that had never existed in the years listed. She circled each inconsistency with a steady hand. "These names," she said quietly, "they're not random, they're connected. Whoever designed this used shell, estates the same way corporations use shell companies, layers that obscure the true owner. The prince's face hardened. So the fraud isn't academic, it's systemic. She nodded once. And expensive, she added. This level of coordination requires dealers, translators, transport handlers, archivists willing to fabricate credibility. Someone built an entire shadow network to sell you a lie. He stepped back, rubbing a hand over his face. Anger, disbelief, humiliation, all pressing for space. My advisors vetted every step. Your advisors were given something designed to bypass vetting. His jaw tightened as a new realization took shape. Someone inside helped them. She didn't confirm, but she didn't have to. The pattern spoke for itself. She spread the final sheet across the table, a shipping manifest with impossible timing. The date stamped belonged to a period when the customs office was shut down due to regional unrest. No shipments entered or exited that week. A perfect provenance, except for one historical fact the forgers hadn't anticipated someone like her would know. He stared at the sheet, the truth filling the room like smoke. "This is bigger than a forged collection," he murmured. "This is a consortium." Her silence was confirmation enough. Corruption often travels elegantly until someone patient enough traces its footsteps. She looked at him calmly. "We follow the names next," she said. "And when we do, the real architects will surface." They began with the estate names, each one a quiet door into a darker corridor. She worked at the long archive table while he paced behind her, every step sharp with contained fury. The room felt smaller now, not because of its walls, but because of the magnitude of what they were uncovering. She mapped the estates into clusters, arranging them by geography, date ranges, and the peculiar rhythm of their appearances in the provenance chain. Patterns emerged, too symmetrical, too convenient. These estates were never active simultaneously. They surfaced only when major collectors entered the market. They operated like shadows, anticipating wealth. The prince leaned over her shoulder, his breath tight. "Which one do we start with?" She tapped the earliest estate listed, one tied to a remote region known for unreliable archives and opaque land registries. "This," she said. "It's the root. Every other estate branches from it." He narrowed his eyes. "Meaning someone built the others on top of this one?" She nodded. "A hierarchy." He clenched his jaw, stepping back as realization crashed into him. This wasn't an isolated fraud. It's a pipeline. She began tracing the signatures next. 3 archivists across decades, all credited with appraisals, all seemingly unrelated. But the handwriting exposed the lie. Same slanted descenders, same pressure-lifted word endings, same rare curve before certain consonants. She laid the pages side by side. The prince inhaled sharply. "One person, or one trained team," she said. "Either way, not a coincidence." He moved to the far side of the table, bracing both hands against it as if holding himself upright. His empire, his reputation, every piece of prestige tethered to his name, was entangled in a fraud, orchestrated with surgical intelligence. She continued piecing together the puzzle, pulling threads with the calm precision of someone who had spent her life chasing truths no one else cared to see. Then she froze. A name repeated across multiple transactions. Not an estate, not an archivist, but a translator. A seemingly minor figure whose signature appeared in the margins of shipping papers, credibility stamps, authentication summaries. The same person. Across different countries, across different decades. The prince noticed her stillness. "What is it?" She handed him one of the documents. "This translator shouldn't exist in all these records. The timeline is impossible. And the signature?" He studied it, his expression darkening. "I've met this man." She turned sharply. When? He was recommended by my advisory board. He handled the linguistic negotiations for the acquisition. The prince's voice grew lower, more dangerous. He told me the collection was flawless. Her pulse quickened. The translator wasn't peripheral, he was central. She picked up the pages again, her mind sharpening. If he's involved, he's not working alone. He's part of the architecture. The prince's eyes hardened completely, the softness she'd once glimpsed replaced by a quiet, lethal resolve. Then we confront him. She shook her head. Not yet. If he senses pressure, he'll vanish. People like him always have escape routes. Then what do we do? She turned toward him, the lamplight catching the calm, fierce intelligence she could no longer hide. We flip the trap, she said. Let him think the acquisition is still intact. Let him think you trust him. We draw him into a controlled space. Your terms, not his. The prince nodded slowly, absorbing the strategy. An academic trap. Precisely. A beat of silence pulsed between them. Sometimes justice begins not with confrontation, but with patience sharpened into strategy. He straightened, every line of his body aligned with purpose. Tell me what to prepare. Their counterattack had begun. The trap required choreography, quiet, deliberate, flawless. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, a stage, and she built it piece by piece. They met again in the Foundation's secure archive room, door locked from the inside. She stood at the center table, calm as ever, while the prince circled the perimeter like a storm contained by stone walls. We invite the translator for a final authentication review, she said, arranging forged and genuine pieces side by side in a deliberate pattern. He will assume you are preparing to announce the acquisition publicly. That's when he'll relax. Overconfidence always exposes the hand. The prince nodded, tension carved into the line of his profile. And when he relaxes, then he'll make mistakes. She pointed to a manuscript whose forged elements she had already dissected. We present him with this piece first. Ask him to explain its origins. His narrative must match the provenance he created. But he won't remember every detail. No forger does. His inconsistencies will be his confession. The prince crossed his arms. He's skilled. He won't fold easily. He won't need to, she replied softly. He just needs to contradict himself once. She then prepared the second phase, a controlled question only an expert could answer, but only one who understood real manuscripts, not fabricated ones. I'll ask him something subtle, she said. A detail about a dialectal form that doesn't exist in the century he claims. When he justifies it, he reveals he fabricated the text. The prince exhaled, almost in awe of the quiet precision with which she dismantled a $500 million fraud. You do this like someone who's been on the other side of these battles. She didn't answer. The memories were too heavy, rejected grants, professors who dismissed her work until they needed it, institutions that praised her brilliance but left her with no funding, no future, no home. She had learned to read truth the hard way, by watching people lie with elegance. She checked the room's setup again. The lighting, the placement of documents, the seating positions, the microphones hidden in plain sight. Everything was crafted to draw the translator into a performance he believed he controlled. She whispered, almost to herself. He forged history. Now we let him forge his own downfall. The prince watched her, a flicker of pride, real, unguarded, crossing his expression. You're the only person who could have seen it. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened for the first time. Truth isn't found by those with power. It's found by those with patience. The plan was ready. The stage set, the translator summoned. Justice sharpens itself quietly before it strikes. She gathered the documents, steady and focused, ready for the moment the liar would walk into his own unraveling. The translator arrived exactly on time. Too exactly. Men like him used punctuality as a form of intimidation, a way of saying, "I control the tempo." But today, the tempo wasn't his. The prince waited at the far end of a long conference table inside a private chamber of the Foundation. Neutral walls, no windows, soft overhead lights designed to expose the smallest micro-expression. She stood near the manuscripts, hands folded calmly before her posture neither deferential nor confrontational. Simply present, steady, unreadable. The translator entered with a confident stride, his polished shoes clicking lightly across the floor. He greeted the prince with rehearsed warmth, but when his eyes drifted toward her, something flickered. Recognition, irritation, maybe even fear. She made no move to acknowledge it. The prince gestured for him to sit. "We're finalizing preparations for the acquisition's announcement. I'd like your expertise one last time." A subtle trap, presented as respect, delivered with quiet precision. The translator smiled, settling into his chair with the comfort of a man who believed he'd already won. She slid the first manuscript toward him. "We'd like your confirmation of its provenance," she said, tone smooth, neutral. "Particularly the marginal notes." He launched into a confident explanation, too confident, narrating the manuscript's supposed journey through obscure estates, referencing archivists whose names she had already proven fabricated. He embellished details, adding flourishes that didn't match his earlier paperwork. His story branched, contradicted itself, then attempted to correct course. The prince watched him with a stillness sharpened by betrayal. She waited for the right moment. Then she asked calmly, "And the dialect of this marginal note, could you explain why it reflects a regional usage that had not yet emerged in the century attributed?" A single breath. A swallow he tried to disguise. A flicker of panic behind his professional smile. He improvised. Badly. Explaining a linguistic evolution that had never existed, attributing it to scholars who had never written in that style, weaving a defense that unraveled with every word. The prince's eyes darkened, not with rage, but with certainty. She placed the final document in front of the translator. "And this signature, your signature, appears in records spanning 30 years across countries you were never in. Can you account for that?" Silence. Real silence. The kind that reveals the truth without needing a confession. The translator's facade cracked, the micro beads of sweat, the shifting jaw, the tiny slide of his fingers toward his briefcase as if escape still existed. The prince leaned forward, voice low and unshakable. "Your work ends here." Fear finally surfaced in the translator's eyes, raw, unfiltered. She watched quietly, not triumphant, only resolute. Her work was done. The trap had sprung. The prince turned to her, something new in his gaze, respect that ran deeper than gratitude. "I want you with me," he said, "not for this crisis alone. For everything that comes next. I need a mind like yours at my side, permanently." The offer hung between them, heavy, life-changing, dangerous. She inhaled, steadying herself. Her debts, her immigration struggles, her fractured academic past. All of it pressed against the possibility unfolding in front of her. This moment could reshape her future, but she would decide it, not be swept into it. Opportunities mean nothing if you lose yourself trying to hold them. She lifted her eyes to the prince, ready to answer. 1 year later, the city no longer swallowed her. It opened for her. She walked through the marble foyer of the prince's restructured foundation, not as a visitor, not as an assistant, but as its newly appointed director of linguistic and cultural integrity. A title built not from prestige, but from earned ground. People greeted her now with respect measured in nods, not hierarchy. She responded with the same calm she had always carried, though the world finally met it at eye level. The scandal had detonated across continents. Investigations, arrests, shuttered shell estates, a network of forged provenance dealers exposed with surgical precision. Some fled, some fought. Some attempted to threaten her, but the prince placed guards around her before she ever needed to ask. Within months, the consortium collapsed, its architecture dismantled piece by piece under the weight of truth. The prince changed too. Where arrogance once lived, awareness had grown. He sought counsel instead of command. He listened before speaking. And though he still moved with the gravity of a man raised inside power, there was a softness now, an understanding of fragility, of deception, of the limits of wealth. They worked side by side through it all, never rushed, never blurred. Two worlds learning how to build an honest space between them. As she stepped into her new office, a quiet room lined with preserved manuscripts, filtered light, and the faint smell of aged leather, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not triumph, not relief, a kind of equilibrium. Her life no longer hinged on survival alone. On her desk sat a folder from the prince, marked only with her name. Inside, documentation confirming her residency, permanent status, expedited, fully funded. Her hands stilled on the papers. For years, she had lived at the mercy of borders and bureaucracies. Now, the ground beneath her feet was finally solid. She walked to the window, watching the city shimmer with evening gold. Below, the prince exited his car with his usual composed elegance, but when he looked up and saw her silhouette against the glass, something in him softened, quiet reverence, not possession. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Freedom feels different when you've built it piece by piece instead of waiting for the world to hand it to you. She turned from the window, ready for the next chapter she would shape on her own terms. The foundation's rooftop garden was nearly empty at dusk, the city lights rising like embers beneath the indigo sky. She stood at the railing, breathing in the cool air, the scent of desert flowers drifting softly around her. This height, this calm, this stability, none of it felt borrowed anymore. The prince joined her quietly, not announcing his presence, simply stepping into the space beside her with a familiarity that no longer felt intrusive. He didn't speak at first. He let the silence settle the way she always had, patient, respectful, unafraid of stillness. "You changed more than the fate of that collection," he said finally, his voice lower in the evening air. "You changed me." She didn't turn immediately. She watched the streetlights flicker into life, one by one, like points on a map tracing the last year of her journey. "People don't change because of others," she said. "They change because truth leaves them no choice." A soft breath escaped him, almost a laugh, but quieter. "Then you brought me truth." She looked at him now, seeing the difference not in his status, but in the way he carried the weight of it. Less armor, more awareness. A man shaped by collapse and reconstruction, not wealth alone. He extended a small wrapped box, not extravagant, not symbolic, simply thoughtful. Inside was a single fountain pen, its body carved from aged walnut, its nib etched with a quiet craft. Not to bind her, not to claim her, to honor her work. "I wanted you to build the future you choose," he said. "Not the one you escaped from." She closed the box gently. "I choose my own path, but I'm glad our paths still cross." For a moment, neither of them looked away. Below them, the city pulsed with possibility. No longer a battlefield, no longer a refuge, but a landscape she had shaped with her own hands, her own mind, her own resilience. The past no longer hunted her. The future no longer frightened her. She stood suspended between both worlds, finally whole. Growth is the quiet victory you win when no one is watching. And as the night settled around them, she felt, for the first time in years, completely, unquestionably free.